I've always felt that the best two time travel stories were The Time Machine and Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. And basically, Back to the Future follows the same type of time travel rules as The Time Machine, which is that you can travel through time but not through space. And a lot of time travel stories violate that concept. Not only do you travel 100 years in the past, but you also travel from Los Angeles to England miraculously. So we believed in the H.G. Wells time machine idea of time travel.
I can't really put my finger on when I stumbled on the idea of time travel, whether it was from watching The Twilight Zone, whether it was from reading Superman comics, or whether it was when the H.G. Wells Time Machine movie, the George Pal movie in 1961 came out. But I do remember being totally fascinated by that film, and it inspired me to read the book. I made my own little miniature time machine out of popsicle sticks. The whole idea of it was just something that I totally got fascinated by.
Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean? I'm from the future.
We've got to get you home.
As I remember, the idea for Back to the Future came about with, and who knows where these ideas really come from, but it was like the notion that Bob Gale had of what it would be like to see your parents as kids when you were the same age as they were.
You're my mom. You're my mom.
My name is Lorraine. Lorraine Baines.
I was back in St. Louis, Missouri, visiting my parents, and searching around in the basement, I stumbled upon my father's high school yearbook. And I'm thumbing through it, and I discovered that my father was the president of his graduating class. I didn't know this, and I thought about the president of my graduating class as somebody I had nothing to do with. So I thought, gee, if I went to high school with my dad, would I have been friends with him? So that was the idea that I came back to Los Angeles, and I said, Bob, what if you could go to high school with your parents? What would that be like?
What are you writing? Stories. Science fiction stories about, visitors coming down to Earth from other planets.
Get out of town. I didn't know you did anything creative.
The idea that every adult was once a kid really had never been done before as a movie. This was an idea, an original idea that we'd never seen dealt with before.
The time period that we selected was purely mathematical.
Action!
It was an 80s kid who had to go and find his parents at his same age, so that put us immediately into the 50s. And that was also the time when the birth of the teenager happened anyway, and teenagers in America were given power by the media, power to buy things. They became an economic power. So that worked out well for us.
I'm from the future. I came here in a time machine that you invented.
When we sat down to write the first script and we said, we need a time machine, where does a time machine come from? The time machine has to be invented in somebody's garage. The archetype American inventor that does stuff like this in his garage, it's Doc Brown.
I was standing on the edge of my toilet, hanging a clock. The porcelain was wet. I slipped, hit my head on the edge of the sink, and when I came to, I had a revelation, a vision, a picture in my head, a picture of this. This is what makes time travel possible. The flux capacitor.
Where did he come from? We kind of had an idea that he probably worked on the Manhattan Project. In fact, with the nuclear aspect of it, we were pretty sure that that was the case. But he went off on his own, and he had these weird ideas about flux capacitors and so forth.
The very first idea of the time machine was that it was a chamber of some sort. Yeah, I guess we had it built into an old refrigerator. But it became very apparent that if you were going to really build a time machine, it should be a vehicle. And probably it should be a tracked vehicle, kind of like a tank. Because if you're going to travel to times when there were no paved roads, you'd have to be able to get around. But we decided to use the DeLorean automobile because of this joke that we had in the movie. When the time machine arrives in the past, the people who live in the farmhouse think that it's an alien spaceship.
Looks like an airplane without wings.
That ain't no airplane. Look.
A lot of people think that Back to the Future is a science fiction movie. A lot of people think it's a special effects movie. The fact is that there are only 31 or 32 special effects shots in the entire film. In discussing with our special effects people and our artists about what was time travel going to look like, we started coming up with, and they started coming up with all kinds of ideas. What is the space-time continuum going to look like when Marty's in the DeLorean? And all kinds of great big visual eye candy. And at a certain point, Bob and I looked at each other and said, you know, that's all bogus. We don't need any of that stuff. Time travel should be instantaneous. This is a story about people. It's not a story about hardware. The hardware is just what we use to make it believable. Mark Twain had the Connecticut Yankee get hit over the head and wake up in King Arthur's time. There's other stories where somebody wishes that they were in the past. And none of these things were interesting to us. We felt that if it was a machine that did it, then it was more believable than if it was a wish, because we know that machines can do stuff, and we don't have any example of somebody wishing for something as crazy as this and ever having it come true. So the machine is just a way to make the idea of time travel believable.
The way I see it, if you're gonna build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style? Besides, the stainless steel construction made the flux dispersal. Look out!
A script is something that's always changing. And what seems like a great idea one day, you might wake up and think it's not such a good idea the next day. Or more likely, you have a great idea, and then the next day or the next week you come up with an even better idea.
1.21 gigawatts! Tom, how am I gonna generate that kind of power? It can't be done, can it?
We had this idea for a nuclear explosion actually being the element that was required to bring Marty back from 1955 to 1985, and we had him go into Nevada to this nuclear test site. It turned out that the expense of that whole sequence was going to cost $1 million, which was a lot more money in 1984 when we were making the movie than it is today. But we couldn't afford it.
Marty, I'm sorry, but the only power source capable of generating 1.21 gigawatts of electricity is a bolt of lightning.
So we put on our thinking caps, and we came up with something that turned out to be far, far better than what this nuclear thing would have been. It kept it all contained in Hill Valley. It kept the clock imagery and the time metaphor much more in the movie. And it was a vastly better sequence than that nuclear test site could have been.
We originally wrote the project for Columbia Pictures, who put it into Turnaround. And this was in the early 80s, and the average teen film in the early 80s was very R-rated. And they were sort of drinking, drugging, sex comedies, and those were the films that were making a lot of money. So most of the studios, when we went to set the film up, thought that the film was too soft because it didn't have a lot of edgy stuff in it, except for Disney, who thought that because of the relationship with the son and the mother, it was too dirty.
Do you mind if we park for a while?
That's a great idea. I'd love to park.
I could see how it would be troubling on paper to people, the idea of a boy and his mother kind of having that kind of relationship. But so much around it was so sweet and so accessible and so engaging. And the intent was not salacious. The intent was not pandering. It wasn't meant to be, gratuitously titillating.
I think a man should be strong so he can stand up for himself and protect the woman he loves.
And Leah, was so brilliant because Leah just played it like this girl. I mean, she wasn't carrying around the whole mother thing in her head when she was playing it. She was playing what this girl might have felt when this kind of mysterious, exciting kid comes into the neighborhood.
Where does he come from? Yeah, where does he live? I don't know. but I'm gonna find out.
I think the purity of her performance, the purity of Bob's intention, and the purity of Bob and Bob's script to just tell an engaging story kind of took away from anything that might have been, creepy about that.
Steven, very early on, he was one of the first people I had read the screenplay, and he liked it very much, and he wanted to produce it like he did in my previous films. But my previous 2 films were not successful, and I was concerned that if Steven had produced a 3rd film that was a box office flop, then I would not be able to probably get a job anywhere as a director. So I explained that to him, and he said, I think you're probably right. And then many years went by, 3 to be exact, and then I was finally hired by Michael Douglas to do Romancing the Stone, which fortunately was a hit. And then everybody wanted to do Back to the Future because Romancing the Stone was a hit movie. And I thought it would only be appropriate to go back to the one guy who was the only person who had faith in it based on the material itself, and that was Steven. Casting is something that you just feel. Crispin and Leah, they all came in and read many times and became the character. Chris Lloyd, I knew he was the perfect Doc Brown the minute he walked in the office without even having to say a word. Just by looking at him, I knew he was perfect.
Christopher Lloyd says that his model for creating the character was actually the conductor Leopold Stokowski, with the hair that way and the big broad gestures. Doc Brown walks around like he's conducting the orchestra of the world, and that's what Chris drew upon.
I notice your band is on the roster for the dance auditions after school today. Why even bother, McFly? You don't have a chance. You're too much like your old man. No McFly ever amounted to anything in the history of Hill Valley.
Yeah, well, history is gonna change.
I was doing a film called Teen Wolf, and I was shooting it in Pasadena. And some people that had showed up on the same block that we were shooting, and they were scouting location. So we said, what location are they scouting for? And somebody said, it's this new movie called Back to the Future. I remember thinking, man, it'd be great to be in a movie like that. Sounds like, a great movie. And Steven Spielberg producing.
Michael J. Fox was actually our first choice for the part of Marty. And because he was doing Family Ties at the same time that we were going to be shooting, there was no way that he was going to be available to us. So it was completely out of the question. And we kept pushing our start date back because we were having such a hard time finding a kid that we thought could carry the movie. For that reason, we did these screen tests because we had to be absolutely sure. So it finally came down to an actor named C. Thomas Howell and Eric Stoltz. And Tommy's screen test was terrific, but the CEO of MCA saw the 2 screen tests, and he said, it's got to be Eric Stoltz. It's got to be Eric Stoltz. And I'm so convinced that Eric is going to be great in this part that if it doesn't work out with him, you recast it and start all over again. Okay, well, he never thought that that was ever going to happen. And we never thought it was ever going to happen, really.
The studio was demanding that the movie be released on a specific day in the summer. So we cast Eric Stoltz in the lead part for Back to the Future, and this was a miscalculation on my part. I mean, Eric is a fabulous actor, and he was doing great work, and it just, for some reason, to me, didn't feel like it was the right type of performance for the type of humor that I was trying to go for in the film. So I had to do a very painful thing and replace Eric with Michael J. Fox.
Michael read the script, he went nuts for it. And his attitude was, hey, I don't need any sleep. I'll do whatever I can to be in this movie.
And about a week later, I was in a parking lot in Pomona, freezing cold, about 2 in the morning, doing the stuff with the DeLorean and the dock. There was no preparation for me at all. I just all of a sudden was on board. I was doing Family Ties and Back to the Future at the same time, so I was getting about an hour, 2 hours sleep every day.
All right, okay, McFly. Get a grip on yourself. It's all a dream. It's just a very intense dream.
So it was really grueling, and it was exhausting, and it took its toll, physically and even emotionally to an extent, because I just didn't know where I was a lot of times. It was my whole life. Every waking moment was about work, but I was 22, 23 years old. It was my dream to be in the film and television business. I didn't know I'd be in them simultaneously. It was just this weird ride that somehow I got on, and I was glad I did.
Thank you.